Uh, Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you here on Capitol Hill for today's Atlantic Council conversation with Senator Jeanne Shaheen. We've got a full house here, and that means a lot considering the tour groups that one has to work one's way through. So thank you so much for being here. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And we've got a terrific audience here. We've got some board members, some ambassadors. I've seen the French, the Dutch, the Albanian, the Slovenian, the North Macedonian ambassador. If I missed anyone,
Romania.
Romania DCM is here, and what did I miss, Dan? Bulgarian Chargé. Okay, I thank you so much. And there's also Dan Fried. Senator Shaheen serves as the ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and as well as the co-chair of the Senate NATO Observer Group. We're looking forward to hosting you again in The Hague. We've been together in Madrid, we've been together in Vilnius, we've been together then in Washington last year. You've been a tireless advocate for strengthening our alliances and confronting authoritarian threats with unity and resolve, so thank you very much for that. Senator Shaheen brings deep insight and bipartisan leadership and experience at a time when unity is essential, both at home and across the alliance. And that sounds like a line of rhetoric, but I can't imagine a time in my life when that's more true than it is today. This is a pivotal moment for Transatlantic Alliance and for the future of global security. As we look ahead to the NATO Summit in The Hague later this month, we do so against a sobering backdrop. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said yesterday in London that Russia could be ready to use military force against NATO within 5 years. He said NATO needed a 400% increase in air and missile defense, and that allies would agree to spend 5% of their national income on defense at a summit in the Netherlands later this month. That's a massive increase. 3.5% will be directly defense spending, and 1.5% will be defense-related spending. Rutte said the alliance needs a quantum leap, and that's his quote, a quantum leap in its collective defense. And the war in Ukraine shows the biggest question is whether all the new spending will bring capabilities soon enough and sufficiently robust. The stakes couldn't be higher, not just for Ukraine's sovereignty and future, but for the credibility of the rules-based international order and a UN charter that should ensure that despotic leaders like Putin are held to account for their aggression and aren't allowed to remake borders or threaten the independence of their neighbors. This year's summit is about reaffirming, but also about increasing commitments and, most importantly, delivering on them. Beyond the threat posed by Russia's aggression in Ukraine and the ramifications for Europe, we need to confront Russia's deepening relationship with China, Iran, and North Korea. The defense-industrial relationship of these four countries is far stronger than it ever was between or among Mussolini, Hitler, and the Japanese ahead of World War II. I recently led an Atlantic Council delegation to visit NATO headquarters and Secretary General Rutte in Brussels, accompanied by industry leaders, because we know it will take all parties, public and private, working together to rise to this challenge. The Atlantic Council, our mission for more than 60 years has been to galvanize U.S. leadership alongside allies and partners to meet the challenges. That's why conversations such as this one are so vital. We're honored to host one of NATO's most distinguished champions in the Senate and a leader on transatlantic cooperation, Senator Jeanne Shaheen. Senator Tom Tillis sends his regrets, who is the co-chair for the NATO Observer Group. He sends his regrets for being unable to join us today as he was called away on urgent business with the President of the United States. But we'll also be very pleased to host Senator Shaheen and Senator Tillis in The Hague. We're also pleased to welcome Andrew Desiderio of Punchbowl News, a sharp and trusted voice on Capitol Hill, to moderate today's discussion. So thank you for being with us, and with that, I'll turn it over, Andrew, to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Senator Shaheen. As Fred mentioned, Senator Shaheen is the co-chair of the Senate NATO Observer Group, which, among all of the acronyms that are used up here on Capitol Hill, we call it the SNOG. Is that right?
Has to be one of the worst.
I was going to say one of the best, actually. Senator Shaheen and Senator Tillis, of course, co-founded, or I guess you could say resurrected the group back in 2018, and for the last several years, they have led the bipartisan Senate delegation to each NATO summit. I've been with them there for the last 4 summits. This upcoming summit in a couple of weeks in The Hague comes obviously at a very critical time. It is the 4th NATO summit since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It also happens to be the first since Donald Trump came back into office here in the United States and brought with him a shift in U.S. policy that has caused our European allies to further reckon directly with their own defense spending, which is an issue that Senator Shaheen, I know, is very well versed in, and it's something that the Secretary General said is going to be a deliverable at this year's summit in a couple of weeks as well. And we want to get into all of that, of course. And Senator Shaheen, I do want to start with what's happening here on Capitol Hill, first and foremost. There's a legislation from Senators Graham and Blumenthal. You are a co-sponsor. About 80 of your colleagues are
82
as well. 82, that's right. You don't get much agreement like that these days in the Senate. It's a sanctions bill, but it's very expansive. It's a very sort of biting sanctions regime. It would impose a 500% tariff on nations that are buying Russian energy, the goal being to force the Russians to the negotiating table to try to find an end to the war in Ukraine. Senator Shaheen, I want to ask you about this effort first because it's one of the ways that Congress can have sort of a direct impact on how this conflict tries to sort of come to an end. What is the rationale for the Senate voting on this legislation right now at this moment, given everything that has happened, especially recently with Putin continuing to target civilian areas in Ukraine, including just overnight?
Well, what we're seeing is continued intransigence on the part of Vladimir Putin, an unwillingness to come to the table, an interest in continuing the war. And we need to do something to change that dynamic. And this sanctions bill has the potential to do that, to say to Russia and Putin that we are going to put as much pressure on you as we possibly can. Now, from my perspective, we should also couple that with additional arms sales to Ukraine and to provide them the equipment and the air defenses that they need to protect against Russia's assault. Obviously, that's a debate we're going to continue to have in Congress, but this sanctions bill with 82 co-sponsors is on the table. It's ready to go. The House is ready to introduce a similar bill, and they have a discharge petition, I understand, so they have the ability to get that to the floor in the House. We need to get this done. We need to say to Russia and Putin, it is time now for you to take seriously an end to this war.
Right now, as you know, the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, is deferring to the White House on this. He's not going to, in other words, he's not going to put the bill on the floor unless he's got buy-in from the President and from the White House specifically because they are, as he describes it, in the thick of these negotiations. What is your reaction to that posture from the Senate Majority Leader? Should the Congress try to sort of put its mark on this issue?
Well, I think so. Obviously, we're an independent body. We should start acting like one. And this is a great opportunity where there is strong bipartisan support to do that. And from the president's perspective, it seems to me that that's the best of both worlds because it gives him deniability. I can tell you when I was governor, it wasn't always against my interest to have the legislature do something I didn't like because I could use that when I was dealing with the issues. So I think that there are some benefits to President Trump in having us move forward with this bill.
The NATO Secretary General said yesterday in a speech in London, quote, "We are all on the eastern flank now," which kind of, I think, perfectly encapsulates this moment that we are in. What are your reflections on sort of a comment like that, especially as we get closer to this year's summit?
Well, as we've heard from the time that Russia invaded Ukraine, the countries in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet republics, the Baltic countries, Poland, those countries that had experienced Russia at war know very directly what the impact of that is and feel very vulnerable, as they should, because they are facing the Russian threat. If Russia is successful in Ukraine, everybody I've talked to says they're not going to stop with that. They're going to continue. They're going to look at where else they can go in Europe. And it's not just about Europe. From our perspective, we ought to be very concerned about what kind of message that a Russian victory in Ukraine will send to all of our adversaries. What is China going to do about Taiwan if they assume that we're not going to continue to engage with Ukraine on this war? What is North Korea going to do about the Korean Peninsula if they assume that we're not going to come to the aid of our allies when we commit to do that? You know, Iran, we're already seeing what Iran has done across the Middle East. So I think there are serious ramifications, not just for our allies, but for our adversaries on the outcome of this war. Not to mention the fact that, as we've seen from history, if we don't stop Putin now, then where does he get stopped? And how does the United States have to continue to engage? You know, I'm old enough to remember my father served in World War II. I remember those history lessons and what happened because we didn't stop Hitler when we had the chance, and how many Americans' lives were lost because of that. I don't want to see my four grandsons have to go to war in Europe because we didn't do what we should have done now to support Ukraine.
I mentioned this at the outset, but defense spending obviously going to be a big topic at this year's summit. You've been part of really a bipartisan effort over the years to push allied nations to get to that 2% of GDP threshold, which was first agreed to, I believe, almost 15 years ago now at the Wales Summit. There's talk this year of increasing that to 3.5 or as high as 5, with a 1.5% buffer there for undefined defense-related items. What do you make of the fact that that's now part of the conversation? Just as as some allied nations have either just now hit 2% or have not yet done so.
Well, we've seen a significant increase, and I think 23 now of 32 nations have hit their 2% of GDP investment in defense, and we have a number of other countries, Poland, a number of the Baltic nations, who are higher than that. And we even have Canada now who has made the commitment to get to their 2%. And they were one of the biggest countries that was lagging behind. So I think that's positive. We've seen good progress, and there's more that needs to be done. And we've heard a lot of discussion coming out of Europe about the need to increase defense spending in Europe, to recognize that it's in the interest of Europe as a whole to be able to do more to support their own defense, and the threat that Europe faces, not just from Russia, but from the same adversaries that we have from China. So I think all of that's positive. I think the challenge is going to be getting there. The United States is only at 3.4% in terms of GDP spending, and given the reconciliation bill here in Congress and other efforts, getting that plus up for defense is going to be challenging. But I think it's an important goal, and it's something that we need to work towards, and it sends another important message to our adversaries that we are serious, that we are going to do something to ensure that we can provide our own defense for threats against our countries.
Tomorrow, you will have a chance to question directly Secretary Hegseth before the Senate Appropriations Defense Subcommittee hearing. It will be a hearing focused on the fiscal year 2026 budget, of course, as we're talking about defense spending here. Can you give us a little preview into how you, I assume, will plan to press him on all this as it relates to NATO?
Oh, I have a long list for Secretary Hegseth. But with respect to NATO, it really is, how are we going to increase funding to that? If that's the goal, how do we get there, and what is DoD doing? Because on the one hand, as we've seen with defense spending, there is a plus up for defense that's been in the reconciliation bill, and on the other hand, they're talking about cutting 8% over the next 5 years on defense spending. So we need consistent messaging, and we need to have a plan for how we're going to get there. And to the extent that we are diverting resources from the Department of Defense to Homeland Security for dealing with immigration issues, it doesn't help us get to where we need to go with respect to national security and our commitment to NATO.
You have a lot of Republican allies on this exact effort that you're talking about. Senator McConnell, for example, he chairs the Defense Subcommittee. He voted against Pete Hegseth, yes, for many of those same reasons that you're outlining here, and he also spoke out very aggressively against the administration's proposed budget for fiscal year 2026. That's obviously going to be a big part of the debate in September as we get closer to the deadline. Obviously, Congress has, everyone knows, the power of the purse. You guys can plus up that funding. You can put restrictions on it, for example, because I know Secretary Hegseth has proposed, and this is something that has come with opposition from Senator Wicker, the Armed Services Committee chairman, but he has proposed doing things like doing away with the Supreme Allied Commander position, which has proven very vital over the years for the United States and for NATO more broadly. Can you talk a little bit about how the Appropriations Committee in the Senate specifically, where you do need bipartisan buy-in in order to pass a bill, how you guys can sort of use that to achieve a lot of what you're talking about?
Well, certainly we have that authority. That requires buy-in from our Republican colleagues, and it will be interesting to see to what extent they're willing to do that. Now, I've been in a number of hearings in the last few weeks where we've had with the appropriation subcommittees, and my colleagues have raised a number of critical issues, but the proof is in the pudding and what ultimately they're willing to support at the table.
I wanted to also touch on, and you alluded to this as well, but our relationships with specific nations within NATO and how the Trump administration has, I guess you could say, altered our posture toward those nations. You mentioned Canada. I was with you guys a couple of weeks ago in Ottawa. You led a bipartisan delegation there focused on tariffs, trade, tourism, which has significantly dropped to northern border states like yours as a result of the administration's posture toward Canada specifically. But I wanted to ask you about that in the context of NATO, because it's not just Canada that's being targeted with these tariffs, right? So how do you think that might impact our ability to, for example, persuade, encourage allied nations to increase defense spending and to maybe use that money to buy their defense articles from the United States, which I know is going to be a focus on the sidelines of the summit as well?
I'm concerned about the reaction to the tariffs and what that means, what it means for the United States, what it means for Europe, what it means for our supply chains. One of the things that, for me, has been an eye-opener about the war in Ukraine has been the recognition that our defense industrial base has not had the capacity to do what we need to do in terms of producing the arms to fight a war like the one in Ukraine. And the tariffs make that worse. The example that, for me, really brings it home is a visit that I made to a company in New Hampshire that does ball bearings for the aerospace industry. And they do a significant amount of work with the Department of Defense. They told me that because of the steel tariffs, that their lead time to get steel has gone from 20 weeks to 2.5 years. Well, we can't produce equipment for our national security, for defense, with a 2.5-year lead time. And so it's not just about the cost, it's about what's the implication for the supply chain. And I've raised this at Armed Services Committee hearing that we had a few weeks ago. Is the Department of Defense tracking this? I raised this also with Secretary Lednick, who was before the Appropriations Subcommittee. I said, did you talk to DOD about these tariffs and what's the assessment of what the impact of those tariffs is going to have on their supply chains, on what they need? He said, oh, well, we gave them the notification. But DOD said they are not tracking this. They are not looking at what the implications are of these tariffs on their ability to get the materials they need for the equipment they need, the arms they need. So I think it's a huge issue. It's going to continue to be an issue. And while I think there are targeted industries where tariffs are appropriate, where the United States in certain industries has been disadvantaged, and we should address those. But blanket tariffs across the board on our allies as well as our adversaries doesn't make sense in my mind. I don't see how that makes us stronger.
You mentioned the message it sends to the Chinese, for example, of a U.S. sort of disengagement from the conflict in Ukraine, from confronting Russia more broadly. The NATO Secretary General Rutte has tried to calm fears that the U.S. could militarily disengage from Europe as a result of this pivot to sort of China being the pacing threat. From what you're hearing, do you feel like allied nations, particularly in Europe and in the eastern part of the continent, do you think that they feel reassured by what the NATO Secretary General is trying to say in terms of calming fears?
Well, I think we need to say it too. So I think it's helpful to have Secretary General Rutte talking about that and talking about being able to rely on the United States. But we also need to reaffirm that. For me, one of the most upsetting errors of the Trump administration to date has been the shutting down of USAID, not the organization itself, but the end of so many foreign assistance programs that have been one of the ways that the rest of the world has engaged with the United States, and we've been able to support democracy in countries around the world. We've been able to look at global health threats and see not just how they're affecting countries in Africa and other parts of the world, but how they're affecting us. And I think to decide that based on about 1% of our federal budget, we're going to discontinue all of those programs that have made such a huge difference for people around the world has been a real loss of American influence. And who's picking up all of that work in countries around the world? It's China, because they see an opening and they're taking advantage of it. It's just like efforts to cut back our diplomatic presence in places around the world. Well, China's increasing their investment in diplomacy around the world and putting people on the ground. So for all the administration, and I agree with them, that China is our toughest competitor, both militarily and economically, the efforts that this administration has done, whether it's tariffs, whether it's eliminating foreign assistance programs, they undercut our ability to compete with China in a way that reflects on our safety and security.
The last three NATO summits, one of the centerpiece conversations has been surrounding a potential U.S. aid package for Ukraine. There obviously have been many that have gone through the Congress and been signed into law, but now that President Trump is in office, the posture surrounding that is different. In 2 weeks at the summit, can you reflect on how, when you arrive there, that conversation is going to be much different, right? You know, the administration is trying to forge some sort of peace agreement right now, yet the last few years, every time you go to the NATO summit, it's about, trying to reassure allies that, yes, we in Congress are going to be passing another aid package for Ukraine, whether it's economic, military, humanitarian aid. That's not a part of the conversation this year, really.
Well, it's not. I do think we need to talk about the sanctions legislation, because I think that will have a real impact if we pass it, and it will send a strong message that we need to send, because we have been urging our European allies that they need to continue sanctions on Russia, and they have been willing to do that despite efforts by Viktor Orban in Hungary to not allow that to happen. So I think that's an important message, but I also think it's important to acknowledge, and I think the NATO summit and our partner countries recognize this, the impact that the war in Ukraine is having. That's what's prompting the increase in defense spending. It's what's prompting concerns about troops on the eastern flank. And sometimes it feels like there's an effort to ignore the war in Ukraine and to assume that things can go on without it. So I think that's an important piece to recognize. And, you know, you said we're in the middle of peace negotiations with Russia and Ukraine, but we're not really. You know, let's be honest here. The president has given Vladimir Putin a pass, pretty much, since he took office. He's finally beginning to say, well, maybe I am being played by President Putin, but we haven't done the kinds of things to continue to pressure Russia to make them be serious about coming to the table. And without that, it's not likely they're going to, despite what has been really courageous and outstanding work on the part of the Ukrainians. I mean, the Operation Spiderweb, where they took out so many of Russia's planes, was just very impressive, and it signals where we're going in terms of warfare, because the state of warfare is changing dramatically, as we're seeing with the war in Ukraine. But in terms of anything beyond rhetoric to try and get a peace agreement, you know, you're all diplomats in this room. You know that diplomacy and negotiations on this kind of an effort takes grueling, day in and day out work. You don't leave the table. You don't go away for months at a time and come back. You continue to work on it, and you have high-ranking people who are part of the discussion, and they have folks who come up with ideas and continue to work with their counterparts on the other side. That is not happening. So for us to suggest that there is a serious peace initiative underway, I think misleads the public about what's really going on.
You know, a lot of this with the ongoing posture of President Trump specifically seems to be that he says on one hand he feels like Putin might be playing him, but then on the other hand he says, you know, we're going to give it 2 weeks, right? We're going to give it 2 weeks, kind of just kicking the can down the road on this issue. Do you worry that we are headed to a point where you know, the Russians are going to feel emboldened to not just continue the attacks that they're already launching like they did last night, again, hitting civilian areas throughout Ukraine, but that they're using this supposed peace process, so-called peace process that's being encouraged by the Trump administration to just not just prolong the war, but maybe intensify it, escalate even further?
Well, sure. They've got, they're again amassing thousands of troops on the northeastern border with Ukraine in Belarus. And the concern is that the longer we delay in getting serious negotiations underway or providing additional support to the Ukrainians, the more it gives Russia an opportunity to rebuild, to restructure, to be prepared to not only go further in Ukraine, but to think about what else they're going to do. I mean, this is, we've seen this pattern. We saw it in Georgia in 2008 when Russia went into Georgia. We saw it again in 2014 in Crimea. Then we saw it again when they invaded Ukraine fully. And so I think short of some critical effort to stop and to change that momentum, this is what we're going to continue to see. And make no mistake, it's going to affect the United States. We can't assume that we can just walk away and say, Russia can take over Ukraine, it doesn't matter to us. Europe can worry about that, it doesn't matter to us. Europe's our biggest trading partner, you know? If you're not concerned about the military implications, you ought to be concerned about the economic implications because we're going to be affected by that. If you look at the EU and what happens to trade, what happens to our economy here at home. So I think there are a lot of implications for what happens here that we're really just scratching the surface of.
I do want to turn to audience questions. I know there are a lot of, as Senator Shaheen mentioned, diplomats here, distinguished guests who would like to ask questions of Senator Shaheen. And I don't think we have another microphone, but if you want to sort of relay it to me, and then I can. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I shout?
Sure, yeah.
Maybe you could tell us who you are and what your position is.
I'm Brigitte Tautra, the Dutch ambassador of the Netherlands. And of course, I'm wishing you a good trip to The Hague, Senator. I think what you mentioned about a 3.5 to 5% DIP, that's of course going to be the Hague Pledge, the most important outcome of this summit. And it will send very strong signals, first of all to Russia against its aggression, but also a strong signal for support to Ukraine, a strong signal because the IP4 is going to be there as well, that the theaters are linked, the security in the transatlantic region and the security in the IP4 region, especially when it comes to the defense industry. About the defense industry, there's going to be a special day also, which is very important that we join forces to actually do more investments in capacity, because it's one thing to have the money, but we need to be able to spend it as well. So I think it's going to be a very good summit when it comes to giving those strong signals and for our deterrence. But my question is, that is all fine and well and difficult enough as it is, but it will be fantastic, that show of unity. And I should not forget also to show that Europe will take a bigger burden when it comes to our defense compared to the US. That's also a very important signal. But what worth is that if in the meantime we cannot continue supporting Ukraine? If we let Ukraine fall, then that whole deterrence and that whole longer-term picture is kind of worthless. So we're in it for the long run, the Netherlands, but we should all be in it for the long run to continue supporting Ukraine. That's not only when it comes to sanctions for Russia, but also supporting Ukraine with weapons. And my question is the US also ready to continue that support?
Maybe I wasn't clear. I'm ready. But the question is, when are my colleagues going to be willing to say publicly what many of them say privately, which is that we need to continue that support for Ukraine, despite what President Trump has said. And so far, we haven't had very many people who have been willing to do that. But I agree, we need to. It doesn't do any good to say we're going to increase defense spending if we're not then going to help Ukraine push back on Russia and end this war.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Then maybe two you can show.
Yes.
My question is really related. I think 3.8 billion have been already appropriated. Is there any way for the Senate to push for the use of this funding for Ukraine?
There is, of course, assuming that we could get the Senate to do that. So I think that the challenge is persuading our colleagues that they need to support getting that funding out. And I think some people are doing that behind the scenes, so that's helpful. But so far, it hasn't produced the desired result.
Yes, sir.
And I'm disappointed. One of the things that I should say here is Tom Tillis has been a really good colleague in supporting NATO, and I'm sorry he's not here because he would have some insights into what's going on there in a way that I don't on the part of my Republican colleagues, because the White House is talking to them. They're not talking to the Democrats in the Senate.
Yes, sir.
Dan Fried, now Atlanta Council, former Foreign Service, and I've been on the Kremlin blacklist since before it was fashionable.
Me too.
Yeah. I found your analysis spot on, and I wish you the best with the sanctions bill, but I have a problem with its practicality. My last job in government was sanctions coordinator. I did the first sanctions after the first Russian invasion. A 500% tariff as a club I don't know that that's practical. We found it difficult to sustain high tariffs with China. There might be another way to do it, and I remember when the Senate jammed down the Obama administration's throat oil sanctions against Iranian oil sales, and that worked. It was a slightly different. So have you all been thinking about the practicality if you ever get there? Because if it's not practical, it's not going to be an effective club. And I think you're right to push the bill. I applaud it.
Yeah, that is legitimate criticism of the effort, and I appreciate that. I have heard that. I do think we've got a little time here between now and passage of something, and so there is an opportunity to address some of the concerns like that would make it actually work better, and I'm hopeful that we can get support to do that.
We have time for one more. He's got the microphone over here.
Thank you, Senator. Jason Davidson, Atlantic Council. I'm curious about what you think about the timeline for the 3.5% of GDP, specifically when we've got a number of NATO countries, as we heard previously, that have just barely reached that 2%, and the risk that some of those countries, I'm thinking Spain, Italy, for example, where public opinion is really opposed to significant increases in defense spending, isn't there a risk that if you push some of those countries too hard, too soon, that they would actually go the opposite direction, perhaps choosing governments that would negate any gains that have been made thus far in defense spending?
Well, certainly I think that's part of what will be discussed at The Hague as part of this summit. There will be negotiations around what's the appropriate use of the 1.5 additional sort of soft spending, as well as the timetable, and that I'm sure our NATO allies will not be quiet about expressing their concerns if they don't agree.
Before we close, I just wanted to note that we're kind of, in Senator Shaheen's last few answers, sensing a theme here, which is that a lot of this depends on what Republicans here on Capitol Hill are willing to agree to and willing to sort of maybe buck President Trump on. A quick reflection as someone who's been here for almost a decade on Capitol Hill. I remember in 2017 when you all passed the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, CATSA is what we call it. That's not as good of an acronym as SNOG, but it does the trick. But CATSA was a very unique piece of legislation in terms of the process that it got through the Senate, whereby President Trump had just won the election. Republicans were more willing, certainly than they are today, to go against his wishes. And it was right after the Russians had interfered in the 2016 election. So you had a Senate that was very intent on getting this piece of legislation done under Republican control. The bill passed through the Senate 98-2. The president and his advisors made clear at the time they wanted no part of this piece of legislation. They didn't want to engage on it. They didn't want to sign it. The president didn't want to sign it. Yet this was an example of the Senate and then the House shortly after showing with strong bipartisan majorities that this was the will of the Congress, essentially forcing President Trump to sign that bill into law, and the really biting sanctions regime that came with it. So. Again, to Senator Shaheen's point, we're not really, in terms of the politics of this, we're not really at a time where Republicans would have that same sort of posture toward President Trump as they did in 2017, and that's why, and that is, I think, complicating some of these efforts. I don't know if you have any reflections on that as well, Senator.
Well, I think that's a really good analysis. My other reflection would be that this is a very different Trump administration than the first Trump administration. And for all that I disagreed with many of the policies of the first Trump administration, I felt like the people, by and large, who were in appointed positions were people who were interested in working on an agenda that I could buy into in many areas. I do not feel that way about this Trump administration. I'm sorry to say that. That so many of the people that have been nominated to positions have been very unwilling to either work across the aisle with Democrats and unwilling to raise concerns about, even when they might disagree with the president. And that's a very troublesome place for us to be, because one of the important things about a democracy, as we all know, is that people need to be able to speak up, and even if we can't agree, to understand that everybody's had a say, and at the end we're going to move forward. Well, because of the efforts at retribution, people are very reluctant to speak up. And again, that's really problematic in a democracy.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Thank you, Atlantic Council, for hosting us. And we hope to see many of you in The Hague in a couple of weeks.
Yes, thank you.